All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. I want to start by thanking our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Dina Bas Pesach, Zechariah ben Zechariah. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Karen and Akiva Noach Andrews, for dedicating all of the learning this week in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Karen's mother, Marsha Bas David V'chana. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors today, the Plonka family, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's right, Zayin Adar today. Moshe ben Amram, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, and for Refuah Shalema for Liel, for Leo Yehuda ben Meira Yael. To thank Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin for dedicating the Daf Yomi this morning in honor of Baruch Meir's father's 80th birthday. Baruch Hashem, what an incredible and beautiful accomplishment. May he go, may Chayil al Chayil, from strength to strength. And I will say, with that, let us begin. So, Meretz Hashem, we have a lot to do today. Meretz Hashem. A lot of ground to cover, a lot of Gemara to do. So today's daf is Tzadik 90. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Peites Amud Beis, and we are picking up at the Ikad Amri. So it's like kind of left you hanging a little bit in the middle of the sugya over here. It's right across from Tosfos Vizeh. Suppose if you remember again, we were speaking about the interesting idea of the ability for a chabura to essentially kind of tell someone to get out, right? That if somebody, the metaphorical phrase or the euphemistic phrase that the Gemara used was someone whose yadayim are yafos, like somebody with beautiful hands. So beautiful hands, of course, was a metaphor for someone who grabs a bit too much too quickly and kind of annoys the rest of the chabura. So we're speaking about the idea that they could tell that individual, why don't you take your portion and go? Take your portion and go. So we'll say, so remember again, this all presupposes that we paskin halacha lamaisa, like the opinion that says that Karban Pesach can be split up in two parts, right? That halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and split a carbon into two and have the same carbon consumed in two locations. What you can't do is go ahead and have one individual consume the carbon in two different locations. So the Gemara says, Ikeda Amri, an alternate version of that which we said, Halo ibaylan, elahachi hudi baylan, b'nei chabura, rashan l'chalik, or in rashan l'chalik. So we'll say, according to this version, so remember again, I will say, in the last piece, the Gemara established that halacha l'maisa, this idea of a chabura being able to say to an individual, tol chelkecha v'tzei, was not just the din by Karban Pesach, but in fact, again, even what the Gemara called siboles, which I guess I was thinking about this. I guess they would call it maybe like a potluck meal where everybody brings something or contributes something together, and one guy just eats faster and more than everyone else. They could tell him, take your portion and go. Take your portion and go. So it's not just a din in Karban Pesach, it's a din in general by any joint meal. So the Gemara says, Ikeda Amri haloi bailan elahachi hudi bailan b'nei chabura rasha in l'chalik or in rasha l'chalik. So we'll say, so we asked, b'nei chabura, do b'nei chabura have the ability to go ahead and split up or not? Tashma, b'nei chabura shayadov sha'achas mehen yavos, rashain lomar lo tel chelkecha v'tzei. So we'll say, so again, we see from the Mishnah that yes, the chabura can split up, because if you have a chabura and one of the members eats too much too quickly, they could tell him, listen, take your portion and go. So the Gemara says, yadav yafos in, ein yadav yafos lo. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says it seems to be only in a case where halacha l'maisa yadav yafos, right, where again he eats very quickly. So there's a compelling reason to do so. But if there's no compelling reason to do so, it would appear that the chabura should not split shmamina. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the way the Gemara kind of ends off is saying, can you split? You can split. But really, unless of course there's a compelling reason to split, one should not do so. So the Gemara says also a great story. Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua, Arivu Rifta Bahadi Adadi. Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua were having a meal together. Listen to this. Ada Achel Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua Chada, as Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua ate one, we'll call it one portion. Achel Rav Papa Arba. So Rav Papa ate 4 times as fast as Rav Huna. So as a result, Amrlei, Poligli. So Rav Huna was getting a little bit annoyed, right? Because that Rav Papa was eating at a much faster pace. So he said, you know what, I have a good idea. Why don't we just split our portions? Why don't we just split up the food? That way you have your chelik, I have my chelik, and that's it. Amrlei, or Poligli could also mean let's separate. So Amrlei, Kablisun. So to which Rav Papa responded, listen, you know me, right? I'm the fast eater guy, right? So when you invited me to eat with you, you were makabel this, right? So I'll say kablisun means that halacha l'maisa, you've accepted this. You've accepted this. So the Gemara says, Isvei kohani tiyuv, so Rav Papa and Rav Huna ended up having, the same exact conversations as they had before. Right? All the same conversations as they had before. So the Gemara says, V'shani kidashaninan, se'esvei b'nei chabura, amrle hasam da amrle ki kablinach, l'tekune zvicha. So we'll say, so remember again, they essentially went through the entire previous discussion that the Gemara went through, right? So Rav Papa saying, you accepted me, right? You knew who I was, you accepted me. Rav Huna saying, well, no, we accepted you ultimately again to do something beneficial, not to be detrimental. Esvei sibolas poligle. So ultimately again, then Rav Huna brought up the discussion regarding the discretionary meal, right? The potluck meal, where the halacha still is that if one of the members wants to force a split, he can do so. Polyglay. So we'll say at that point, Rav Papa said, fine. First wide line, pay tessim with base on the bottom. So at that point in time, Rav Papa said, fine. You want to split up? We'll split up. So we'll say, so now watch this. So now at this point in time, Rav Huna went his way, Rav Papa went his way. Azul Arev Bahadei Ravina. So Rav Huna then went to have a meal with Ravina. Adda Achil Rav Huna Breid Rav Yoshua Chada. So by the time Rav Huna ate one portion, Achil Ravina Tamnia. Ravina went and ate 8 portions. So we'll say, so Rav Huna went from Rav Papa, who ate 4 times as quickly as him, to Ravina, who ate 8 times as quickly as him. Amar mea papi v'lo chad Ravina. He said, it's better to dine with 100 Rav Papas and not one Ravina. So I'll say, so there's a lot of incredible lessons to learn from this story. So we'll say it's also possible that what? It's also possible that Rav Papa was just a slow eater. That's the other possibility. That maybe it could be that everyone else is not the fastest eater, that Rav Papa is a very slow eater, which is a good muster in life, because sometimes we see what we perceive to be dysfunctional situations, and we often assume that the dysfunction is everyone else. Right? This is so broken because you're broken. Well, sometimes if I look around the world and I see that everyone is broken and I perceive that everyone else is the issue, it may be kedai to just take a quick look in the mirror to make sure that I'm actually whole and everyone else is broken, as opposed to perhaps me suffering a little bit from the broken kite in life. I'll say it also, that's one lesson. The other lesson I will say is this idea of kablisun, right? This idea that in these chaburas, there's this concept that the fast eater or that the shamans could say to the rest of the group, you knew who I was, you have to accept me as is. This incredible yisod in life relationships as well. That halacha l'maisa, I will say, sometimes you have to accept, sometimes you could have differing expectations of people, and sometimes you have to learn to accept people as they are. Sometimes in life there's so much relationship discord because I want this person in my relationship to be like this. I want you to be like this. I want you to behave like this. I want you to accomplish this. And sometimes sometimes you have to accept people for who they are in order to be able to maintain normative life relationships. So we'll say two dramatic life lessons from this sugya. So we'll say the Gemara goes like to Tana Abanon. We'll say this is an incredible Gemara that's now going to go into the next sugya. Tana Abanon. Hamamana achirim imo al pischo va'al chagigaso. If you include other people in your Karban Pesach and on your chagiga, so what's the halacha? Ma'os shebiyado chulin. So ultimately, again, money that you receive from these individuals is chulin. So we'll say what this means is as follows. So halacha l'maisa, this is what we're talking about this whole time. I happen to own the sheep, but again, I'm not going to eat the whole sheep myself. So I include a chabura. So how does the chabura work? I will say, bipashtos, people buy in. Right? So I sell you, right, $25 for your piece of lamb for Korban Pesach. So no problem, I sell out the Korban Pesach. The Bryce is now saying, same thing with Chagiga, the money received for those carbonic portions is chulin, which is a dramatic halacha. It's chulin. Hamocher olasa ushlamav lo asa velo klom. Similarly, but if you go ahead and you sell your ola or your shlamim to someone else, the sale is invalid. Now, the reason the sale is invalid is because once that ola, once that shlamim is designated for me, I can't really sell it to anyone else. Umaos koshen yiplu nadava, and any money I receive for such a sale, by definition, should be used for carbon nadava. So Gemara says, I don't understand. I don't say. You just told me that if I try to sell my shlamim or my olah, that the sale doesn't work. Well, if the sale doesn't work, I will say, then what? Then the money is not the money should just be returned to the owner. What do you mean the money goes to carbon nadava? Amarava knasa. Oh, it's a knas. Chazal did not want to create a carbonic market. So what's the best way to disincentivize the sale of sacrificial items is penalize everyone. The sale doesn't work, and by the way, you don't even get the money back, right? You seller, you buyer, don't even get your money back. Instead, your money is yiplu linedava. Umay kol shehin. What does it mean? All of the money. Afagav delo havushava al arba v'yovu chamisha filu b'hahi yisera nami kansuavan. What it means is as follows: even if the carbon was only worth 4 zuz and you sold it at a premium for 5 zuz, you might have thought maybe the premium amount at least shouldn't go to the dollar. Maybe I could keep the premium amount, or maybe the premium amount goes back to the purchaser. No, the entire amount is yiplu l'nadav. So it's an incredible halacha. Once you have designated sacrificial animals, you cannot sell those karbanos to anyone else. And if you try to do so, then halacha l'maaseh, everyone's penalized. The sale doesn't work, and the money goes to Nadava, even if you sold it at a premium. Let's go back and analyze the first case. So I say, I don't understand this first halacha. So let's analyze this. You told me that, let's say again, I own the lamb, and Ruvain wants to join my Korban Pesach. So say, no problem, $25. So I separated out the lamb for Korban Pesach, so the lamb is Kodesh. Ruvain separated out money to purchase his portion in Korban Pesach, which is Kodesh. So I'll say, and now you're telling me that the money becomes Chulin. So, which means when I receive the money from Ruvain, pretty much I could do whatever I want with that money. Right? I could purchase Pesach items, or I could purchase a new suit for Yom Tov. I could do whatever I want. So the Gemara says, how does that work? How does both of these, remember, say the lamb is Kodesh, the money set aside by Ruvain to purchase a portion of my Korban Pesach is money set aside for sacrificial acquisition. How does everything that's hektish suddenly become chulin? So we'll say it's a good kasha, it's top of tzaddik. I'm Abaye. So we'll say, so now what the Gemara is going to do is like this. We're going to go through a number of attributions, but the actual case of the attribution is not going to come until later on. Rashi goes through it, but instead, we're just going to read through the first couple of lines, and then we'll see the case that the Gemara is referring to. Amr Abaye. So Abaye says like this: Ilav du'ukmi Rabo Shialahi b'memana zona apischo v'rebihi. If Rabo Shia would not have set this up as a case of memana zona apischo, I will say, so I'll tell you what this case is, but I'll plug it in just a moment. This is actually quite fascinating. Memana zona apischo means like this: a man went to a zona, used the services of a zona. And then what happened? So he has to pay her. So how does he pay her? This is quite fascinating. He gives her a portion of his Korban Pesach. Right? So I'll say, by the way, it's an incredibly important musar. Just because a person commits one avera, Shul says sarcastic tzaddik, it's very important to say, just because you commit one avera, doesn't mean you're a rasha. Doesn't mean you're a rasha. Because if that's the case, we're all Rishayim. We're all Rishayim. Right? None of us is consistent, and no one of us is perfect, and no one of us lives a life of absolute virtue. So the guy went to a zona. People go to zonos. But just because he goes to a zona doesn't mean he doesn't have Korban Pesach. sounds crazy to us because it's a bit of, again, it sounds like a little, it's like a little bit tone deaf, like a shtickle tone deaf. Like there are probably better ways and more discreet. I was like, can you imagine this chabura? Oh, hi, who are you? How do you know Ruvain? How do you know Ruvain? What's your, you guys are related? You work together? Yeah, you could say that. Kind of work together. So again, like the metzias of it. Okay, I'm not sure how that plays out. But Lamaisa, it's a fascinating case. He's paying her with the chelek of Karban Pesach. Now you're going to see what that's important. So we're going to see what that really is going to get to. We're going to see the case. What that really gets to is, what is the status of Karban Pesach? Is Karban Pesach my property, or is Karban Pesach Kula Kodesh? The nafkamina, of course, for that is, can you pay the zona with your Karban Pesach? I mean, there are other nafkaminas also. But Lamaisa, right? If it's yours, then technically speaking, you could pay the zona, right? If it's not yours, then ultimately, again, you can't be memana the zona ultimately as a form of repayment. So again, we'll see this. So the Gemara says, so lahim memana zona al pischa. So again, as Abaye says, if ultimately, again, Rabbi Oshia would not have set up this case as going ahead and giving a zona a portion of Pesach as payment for her services in accordance with Rabbi, I would have a mukmina leilahi b'kadshim kalim va'aliba de Rabbi Yossi Haglili. The Amar kadshim kalim mamon bailimhu. So both sides. So comes along Abai, and Abai says like this: if you want to understand this idea that the money received for the purchase of a portion of Karban Pesach is chulin money. So Abai says, we're going to see in just a moment that the way Rabbi Oshia sets this up is the case of memana zona and in accordance with Rebbe. We'll see that in just a moment. Abai said, if you would have asked me, I would have said there's a simpler understanding of it. Karban Pesach is kachim kalim. Kachim kalim, right, is lower sanctity sacrificial items. And Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds, Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds that halacha l'maisa, kachim kalim are mamon bailim. Kachim kalim have the status ultimately of property of the owner. So because of that, now that makes sense. I'll say if Pesach is kachim kalim, and if Rabbi Yossi Haglili kachim kalim is the possession of the owner. So when Reuven pays me $25 for a portion of my Karban Pesach, that's my money. That's my money, and that's why the Brisa says that the money is chulin. Avol b'Pesach lo mishayu inish. Rabbi say, but it's quite possible that halacha l'maisa by Karban Pesach, this might be an exception. And by Karban Pesach, a person might not go ahead and retain a portion in it. So let's take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Delo meshayir inish pektusha sakov tebehema v'taima derebi de'amar michtei mekach mushum debamos meshayir inish. So we'll say, we're going to see as follows, that it's possible, again, this will all make sense in just a moment, but it's possible to say that halacha l'maisa, you might have a case where the karban itself might be kula kodesh, but the monies received for a portion in that karban could be chulin. Everything is a question on how Karban Pesach is going to be structured. So b'ma'os vaday mishayir inish, it's possible that money received for a karban Pesach, for a Karban Pesach, ultimately, again, a person retains a certain ownership in them. That when you set aside money for the purpose of purchasing a Karban Pesach, it could very well be that it's set aside with a particular way to retain ownership in it. So let me just show you what's just been floated out here. Which just follows a couple of things. First of all, the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, which is kachim kalim are mamon bailim. So I'll say, if you hold that kachim kalim are mamon bailim, that means Karban Pesach is the possession of the owner. If Karban Pesach is the possession of the owner, then halach l'maisa, of course, then when I receive money for a portion in it, that money is mine. What the Gemara now is going to say, even if you set the idea on the side, it's possible to say as follows. So I will say, really what this comes down to is a fascinating chakira. When I go ahead and I have a Karban Pesach, so there are two ways in which I could, Rashi brings this down, but let's say it's outside. There are two ways in which I could possibly convey a portion of that to someone else. Possibility one is you pay, right? You purchase a portion of Karban Pesach, and therefore the portion is yours. In which case, halacha l'maisa, the money should technically become kodesh. Or the other possibility is, no, you don't purchase anything. You give me money, but the truth is really what happens is I gift you a portion of Karban Pesach. I gift it to you. The money is a Yom Tov gift, but the money itself doesn't have kedusha. The money itself, ultimately, again, is just a gift, has the status of a matana, and therefore it's chulin. So what's what the Gemara is suggesting is as follows. Or the third possibility is, the money may be purchase of a portion. But lemaisa, when Reuven separates out the money, he separates it out with the condition, with the t'nai, that halacha lemaisa, the recipient of the money, could do whatever he wants with it. So while it's true that it's payment for a portion of Karban Pesach, the owner of the money has the right to do with it as he pleases. So those are all the things. So we'll say, all of this centers around this brisa, which is the status of money received for a portion of Karban Pesach. What can or can't you do with that money? So here we go. It could very well be that according to Rebbe holds that Karban Pesach, a person does not retain any level of ownership in it. Therefore, once you consecrate a Pesach, it becomes totally Kodesh. However, the money, the way that the purchaser, we'll call him Reuven in this case, designates that money, he designates the money with a t'nai, that when he conveys that money to the owner of the Pesach has the right to do with that money as he pleases. So the Gemara says, "V'ahida kamoki le Rabbi Yoshia kerebi, lo mukmina le ana kerebi de Pesach lo mishayer inish, o b'mos mishayer inish, to be ikara ki mafresh lehu adaiti dahachi mafresh lehu." So I will say, what the Gemara is driving at over here is this lashon of b'mos mishayer inish means that a person retains a level of ownership in the money. How does that level of ownership manifest itself? That when Reuven pays me, quote unquote, for a portion in my Pesach, it's understood that he says the recipient of that money has the right to do with the money as he pleases. That's why the Brisa says over here that money received for Pesach is considered to be chulin. But you can't really establish this as Rabbi Yossi Galili, who says that kachim kalam amamam bailim to hatani bay v'hamocher olasa ushlamav lo asav lo klum. Because remember again, Abba, the same Brisa said that if you sell your ola and your shlamim, such an act is totally invalid. So the Gemara says v'hashta, first wide line tzadik amad aleph, v'hashta du'uk me raboshia lahi b'memana zona apischo v'rabihi. And now that we set up this case, Rabbi say, ultimately, again, by Karban Pesach at least, as a case of where you're going ahead and giving a zona for payment for her services, a portion of your Pesach, v'rebihi, shmamina desvirale, afilu bepischo, mishayer inish. Now, Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. If you want to say that halacha l'maisa, a man could pay a zona for her services by conveying to her a portion of his Karban Pesach, so we'll say, what does that mean? Not only does a person reserve rights in the money, right, in the money paid for Karban Pesach, but what else do they reserve rights in? What else? In Karban Pesach itself. Because now what I'm doing is I'm utilizing Karban Pesach to satisfy a debt. Right, so I owe this woman, right? Reuven owns this woman money, and therefore halacha l'maisa, what he's paying her with is a portion of Karban Pesach. So halacha l'maisa, we see that a person is not only mishayer, doesn't only retain ownership rights in money paid for Karban Pesach, but in fact Karban Pesach itself. So Mahi, what's the case of Rabbi Say? Mahi Rabbi Oshia. What is the case of Rabbi Oshia? So Rabbi Say, so that's why I said it's going to work a little bit backwards. We quoted Rabbi Oshia, now the Gemara says, what's the case? Here we go, this nan. Nasan la mukdashin be'esnana hari elu mutarin. So we'll say, now watch this. This is not talking about a case. Reuven, we'll call them, went to a zona and now has to pay her for her services. So how does he pay her? He gives her a carbon. He perceived the kedusha that she has, and therefore it's fit for her to be paid with a carbon. So, mamish, this is an animal actually designated as a carbon. So the Gemara says, "Hare elu mutarin." You could actually offer up that carbon. You could offer up that carbon on the mizbeach. Rosh Hashanah says, remember again, the Torah says explicitly that an animal given to a prostitute for her services cannot be offered up as a carbon. What the Gemara is saying over here is, if you gave her an animal that was already designated as a carbon for her services, you could offer up that animal. Why can you offer up that animal? We're saying, because once the animal's already been designated as a carbon, you can't give it as payment for anything. Why not? Because it's hektish. And once it's hektish, you can't go ahead and utilize it to satisfy your own debts. Therefore, again, you could actually offer up that animal on the mizbeach. However, ofos techulin hare elu asurin. However, if you paid her with birds, which are chulin, halacha l'maisa, you cannot subsequently use those animals as a karban. Shahayu bedin, because I could have made a kavachomer. What's the kavachomer? Uma'im mukdashim shamum posa bohen ein esnan umechir chalalehen. So because I would say like this, by animals, by karban, right? Mukdashin, an animal that is already a karban, if that animal develops a mum, that mum would preclude it from being offered up as a karban. Yet, halacha l'maisa, the designation of esnan zona, which is payment for a zona, does not take effect on them. Ophos she'in hamum posaban, but ophos. So we'll say, interestingly enough, in the world of birds, sacrificial birds, so mum does not disqualify a bird. So ophos she'in hamum posabahen. Eino din she'in esnan umechir chalalein. I would have thought for sure that the din of esnan, payment for a zona, is not chal. Tamulomar l'chol neder l'rabos es ha'ofos. Therefore, the pasuk says l'chol neder to include birds. So both say that based on, so remember, so therefore the Gemara is saying is like this: if you pay the zona with an animal that's already consecrated as a karban, you can still offer up that animal, because essentially the esnan, the payment identity does not devolve upon the karban, because the animal is already designated as a karban. But if you pay her with unconsecrated birds, then einachinami, those birds cannot be offered up as a karban. Now, once they say that, I'm going to say as follows: I can make a kavachom in the opposite direction. If birds which are not subject to halachos of mum can become an esnan zona, could become the payment for a zona. Mukdashin shamum posa bahen. So we'll say when it comes to mukdashin, which are invalidated by mum, I would certainly say that the designation of esnan, payment for a zona should preclude them from being offered. Tamulomar l'chol neder. Therefore, the pasuk says l'chol neder prat lindadur. It comes to exclude something which has already been pledged, which of us is what we were saying before. That essentially what the Gemara is saying is like this: something that is already designated as a karban cannot have that status set aside by now offering it up or by now designating it as an esnan. So if it's already a karban, the fact that you decide to pay a zona with it does not remove the karbanic status, and therefore the animal could still be removed. Could still be offered up. Masha'in kain, if you have a chulin animal and you now pay the zona with it, that's now esnan zona, and halacha l'maisa can't be used as a karban. Elataima dekasiv rachmana neder. So we'll say, so the reason is because it says neder. In other words, we'll say neder means, the pasuk that Gemara is quoting over here is Lo savi esnan zona u'mechir kelav beis Hashem elokecha l'chol neder. You cannot bring an animal that was given as payment to a zona, ultimately again l'chol neder, for any neder, for any vow that you have made to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Gemara is darshaning over here, l'chol neder means anything that you're going to vow. But if something is already vowed, if something is already designated as a karban, and you decide to give that to the zona, it could still be offered up, because this designation as nadur, as already pledged, is not set aside by now. It's presently being given over to the zona. The reason for this Rosh Hashanah says neder. Halav haki hava amina mukdashin chal isser esnan alehen. So I'll say, so again, without neder, I would have thought that when a man goes ahead and pays the zona with a sacrificial animal, I might have thought that the designation of esnan zona kind of sets aside the karban status, and now the animal becomes prohibited. But how could that happen? But I will say, how could that ever happen? Remember, once an animal is designated as a karban, who does it belong to? The Ribbon Shalom. Once Ribbon Shalom, I have no right to ask for something that does not belong to me. As such, once it is designated as a karban, halacha l'maisa, what right do I have to go ahead and designate it as an esnan zona? Amraoshia, what's the case? So we'll say, what's the case? What is the case where I could take something which is consecrated and use it as payment for a zona? Says Rav Oshia, I'll tell you, Rav Oshia, b'memana zona al pischo. We'll say, I'll tell you a case of where you could take a karban. Remember again, because we'll say, the notion of using a karban as esnan zona, the Gemara says, is counterintuitive. Because ultimately, again, that would mean answering something which doesn't belong to me. Well, generally, you can't answer something that doesn't belong to you. We'll say, right, if I get angry at you and I decide, you know what, I'm gonna get back at you. I'm gonna worship your car as avodah zarah. Oh, because what happens? We'll say, Avodah Zarah is Aser Ba'ana. So I'm going to go over to your brand new car. I'm going to worship it as Avodah Zarah. And now your car is Aser. Doesn't work. I can't Aser something that belongs to you. It doesn't work, I will say. So the Gemara says, if an animal is a carbon designated to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I decide to pay the zona with it. So ultimately, again, how could I make something that doesn't belong to me Aser? To which the Gemara says, I'll show you the case of paying the zona with the sacrificial item, where maybe it could become us. So what's the case, Rabosai? Of where I give the zona a chelik of my carbon Pesach. That's the case. So I'm taking a sacrificial item, carbon Pesach, and I'm giving the zona a portion of it as payment for his services. The Rebbe and ultimately again, this is the position of Rebbe. What does Rebbe say? My Rebbe, the Sanya, im yimat habayis mios miseh. So we'll say Rebbe says, the pasuk says literally, if you have too few people in your home to consume a whole lamb, so we'll say, so what do you do in that circumstance? So the Torah says, v'lakachu ushchenu hakarov el beiso, b'michsas nefashos. You could include other people on your carbon Pesach. So the Gemara, so Rebbe Darshans, I'm sorry, before Rebbe, the Gemara, the Brisa says, v'im yimat havayis mios miseh hechiyu miseh. So we'll say, what does this mean? That halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and use the money. So we'll say, what the Torah is telling me is, there's not enough people in my home to finish up the seh. No problem. You could sell portions to people, include other people. But what can you do with the proceeds? You can only use the proceeds for other carbon Pesach purposes. So the Gemara says, Michtei achila v'lo michtei mekach. Halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and use the proceeds for anything to do ultimately again with carbon Pesach. Rashi says, Michtei achila, first one line in Rashi, Im yachsar lo ma'os, she'in lo b'ma likach tzorchei achila sa Pesach, he gon itzim l'tzloso, Rashi l'mochro. So we'll say, so the halacha is, you could sell portions of carbon Pesach, but you are limited with what you could use the money for. What can you use the money for? Only things related to carbon Pesach itself. So Rebbe says, Michte'af michtei mekach. Rebbe says, no. Once you receive the money for a carbon Pesach, you can do whatever you want with that money. Shim'ein lo mimena memana acher imo apischo ve'al chagigaso umos shebiyado chulin shal menas kein hikdishu Yisrael es pischer. Wow. Both I said, now we have it. Rav Oshia teaches me that halacha l'maisa, I have the ability to pay a zona with a chilik of carbon Pesach, which I will say tells me that halacha l'maisa, carbon Pesach is still mamon bailim, right? There's still a certain ownership that exists by carbon Pesach, so I could take a sacrificial item and I could go ahead and pay a zona with it for his services. And Rebbe comes along and says, by the way, money that you receive for carbon Pesach, for a chilik on carbon Pesach, it's chulin. You could do whatever you want with that money. The Tanna Kama says you could only use that money for Pesach purposes. Rebbe says you could use the money for whatever you want. Why? What's the logic, Rebbe say? Because Rebbe says when a person purchases carbon Pesach money, that money is set aside with the T'nai that the owner could do whatever he wants with it. That's the nature of the way the money itself is designated by the person who is giving over, by the person who's conveying that money. So we'll say, listen to this. Rabbi Rabbi Zera says as follows. We'll say that everybody agrees that obviously, of course, you can go ahead and use the money for the purchase of carbon Pesach, or you could use monies received for Pesach to go ahead and halacha l'maisa buy wood and other things for Pesach, because that's called a necessity for Pesach. Kipli, where does the machlokes come up? Listen to this. B'matzah u'maror. I will say, can you use money received for carbon Pesach? So I own the lamb. Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, they're all joining in with me. So can I go ahead and use that money? Everybody agrees that I can use money to purchase wood, to burn the Pesach, to roast the Pesach, of course. Can I use the money for matzah and maror? So I say, listen to this. So Rabbanan Savri ha'achilach risihi. The Rabbanan say no. You can only use money for direct consumption related to carbon Pesach. And ultimately, again, matzah and maror is not directly related. For Rabbi Savra came on the Echshir the Pesach, he could go for the Pesach time. Rabbi says, what are you talking about? It's Echshir. We're supposed to say, how do you eat carbon Pesach? How do you eat carbon Pesach? al matzos umerorim yochlu. So even though it's not direct consumption, it's part of the manner of consumption. So of course you can spend money on that. So the Gemara goes weiter. Right. So the Gemara says, V'chadam, or the other opinion says, no, matzomar nami kuli amal pligi dichsev al matzom yochlu. No, the second opinion says, no, of course everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and use the money to purchase matzah, because that's part of the consumption of Pesach. The chayvin the machshir Pesach kipli, where this machlokes come up. Likach bo cholok, likach bo talis. Can you use monies received for Karban Pesach to go out and purchase a new suit? So the Gemara says, "Rabbanan savri miyos misem rachmana hechiyu l'seh." The Rabbanan say miyos miseh, which means literally you can use the money, but the money must be used to somehow sustain the Karban Pesach. In other words, it must be used for direct Pesach purposes. For Rebbe Tzavar, hechya atzmecha miseh. You could even sustain yourself from the set. In other words, you could use the money for whatever you want. For Rebbe, that was according to Abai, this was Abai at the top of the daf, who said that ultimately, again, if Rabbi Oshia did not set up this case as Mimana Zona al Pischo, in accordance with Rebbe, who holds that you can use the money for whatever you want, I would have set this up as a case. I would have set this up in accordance with Rabbi Yosef Lili, who holds Kadshim Kalim Mamon Bailim, Aval Pesach Lo Mishayer Inish, but by Pesach, Rabbi Yosef Lili holds that a person does not retain ownership in it. Katani behedya shalmanas kenik tishu Yisrael pischayen. Shabbos say the Brisa says explicitly that Klal Yisrael were makdish pischayen with the intention of retaining some level of ownership. That directly contradicts Rabbi Yosef Lili. Ema shalmanas kenik tishu Yisrael is maos pischayen. No, say what it means is Klal Yisrael were makdish the maos. They were makdish ultimately again the money of Pesach. That halacha l'maisa, monies used to purchase Karban Pesach were ultimately set aside with the express idea that they could be used ultimately again for any purpose. So we'll say, so how do we paskin halacha l'maisa, right, with this entire sugya? So we'll say, so this is really fascinating because this gets to the core of Karban Pesach, and it also gets to the core halacha l'maisa of the money's paid for Karban. So suppose to listen to this. So the Rambam Paskins, this is in Hilchos Karban Pesach, Perek Dalet Haloch Yud Aleph. So the Rambam says, Eitzim shel tzlias ha-Pesach ke-Pesach, v'chei matzu mor hove machshirei ha-Pesach, hariyim ke-Pesach, v'im lokoch mimos ha-Pesach mimishem mana osan, imo k'dei l'nosa mos ha-Pesach mar, o lichyos, bottom line, harei ha-mos chulin. So say the Rambam actually paskins that halacha l'maisa, like Rebbe, money that you received for the purchase of a portion of Karban Pesach, halacha l'maisa is chulin. So this is incredibly important. So I have the lamb, I want to sell portions. Any monies received ultimately again for the sale of Karban Pesach purchases is chulin. A pretty dramatic halacha. The Rabbim also paskins, you should not give a zona a portion of the Karban Pesach as payment for our services. I don't think that comes as too much of a shocker, but Lamaisa, that's ultimately how the Rambam paskins. Beautiful. We'll say next sugya, Mishnah, Zav Sharash Deiriyus. We'll say there's a lot more to say on that sugya also, because I just want to point out what that sugya highlighted. The nature of Kachin Kalim, but also the fundamental nature and machlokis regarding the relationship of the owner to Karban Pesach. Does he retain some level of ownership with it? But again, and also the nature of monies paid for Karban Pesach. So one thing that's good is monies paid for Karban Pesach, monies paid for a portion for Karban Pesach are absolutely considered to be chulin. Beautiful. Mishnah, quickly. Zav shirash de're'iyas. We'll say back to Zav. A Zav who sees to so we'll say, so very quickly we know the halacha is Zav who sees two re'iyas has to go ahead and observe Shivanekiyim. If he only goes ahead and sees one re'iyah, he just needs one clean day. Zava, two re'iyos, Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, she just has to keep one day. 3 re'iyos, Shivanekiyim. So we're going to see something fascinating. Zav shirash de re'iyos, shochten alav b'shvi. So we'll say, here's the interesting case. What happens if you have the following situation? You have a Zav who has 2 re'iyos, and therefore requires Shivanekiyim. Now the way a Shivanekiyim work out, 7 clean days work out, is that halacha l'maisa, he will be tahar come Pesach night. So on Erev Pesach, he is still Tommy. Let's say, for example, he went to the mikvah during his day number 7 was Erev Pesach, but Lamaisa, he's actually not fit to eat karbanos until the night of Pesach. So the question is, the statement the Gemara is making is that halacha l'maisa, you could shech the carbon on his behalf on Erev Pesach, even though what? He's not actually fit to consume until that night. So the Gemara says, Zav shosh de'ri'os, shochten alav b'shvi, ra shalosh, shochten alav b'shmini. Now I will say, if a Zav sees 3 re'iyos, not only does he have to wait Sheva Nekiyim, but what? Halacha l'maisa, he has to go ahead and also bring karbanos. He has to bring bird karbanos. That's done on the 8th day. So halacha l'maisa, if he had 3 re'iyos, then halacha l'maisa you could shecht as long as Erev Pesach is his 8th day. What all the Mishnah is saying is that halacha l'maisa, you could shecht on behalf of someone who is presently tamei, as long as what? By the time consumption comes around, they will be able to eat, which I will say is a chiddush, because otherwise I would have thought that what? In order to be part of a chabura, what has to happen? You have to be fit bisman shchita. Kamash malon, that even if you're not fit at zman shchita, but you will be fit by zman achila, you can include you as part of a carbon. So the Gemara says, Shomar Yom Keneged Yom, Shoktan Allah, B'Shein Isha. Similarly, again, if a woman's a Shomar Yom Keneged Yom, she had 1 re'iyah, so halacha l'maisa, we could shecht on her behalf on her clean day. Ra'as shnei yamim, but if she saw 2 days, shokt on ala b'shlishi, you can go ahead as long as she's on her day number 3, halacha l'maisa, you could shecht on her behalf. Zava also means a woman who has to observe Sheva Nekiyim, shokt on ala b'shmini, halacha l'maisa, you could shecht on her behalf on day number 8. So as long as by nightfall, she or he, whoever's time will be able to eat, you can shecht on their behalf. Amrav Yehuda Marav, shokt in v'zarkin at tvul yom. So Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Rav Salacha. It's the same idea. Tvul Yom also means a person who went to the mikvah but requires hair of shemesh. You could include him in the chabura, shecht on his behalf, even though he can't presently eat now, because he'll be able to eat that night. Mechusar Kippurim. Mechusar Kippurim also means someone who has to still bring karbanos. Amud Beis, ve'ein shoktin v'zarkin al tamei sheretz. So this is very interesting, I will say. Halacha l'maisa, however, if somebody is tamei tumas sheretz, which means he became tamei, he's tamei now, but even though he can remedy that tumah by nightfall, you cannot shecht on his behalf. Why that is, we'll see. Va'ula amar af shoktin v'zarkin al tamei sheretz. Ula says no, you can even shecht and include in the chabura someone who's tamei tumas sheretz. Ula Rav, Maishna Tavul Yom. So we'll say, according to Rav, why is it? I don't understand. We'll say, you could shecht on behalf of a Tvul Yom. Who's a Tvul Yom? Person went to the mikvah by day, but still requires Harav Shemesh. So I could shecht on behalf of a Tvul Yom, yet I can't shecht on behalf of someone who's a Tamei Tumas Sheretz. So the Gemara says, so Ulurav, Maishna Tvul Yom, Dechazi La'orta, because the Tvul Yom will be fit by nightfall. Right? You remember someone said Tvul Yom did everything he needs to do already. All he requires is Harav Shemesh. So the Tamei Sheretz Nami Chazi La'orta. I don't understand the guy who's Tamei Tumas Sheretz. He could also be fit by night. Right? You must remember that Tumas Sheretz is one of the lowest forms of Tumah. He could also be fit by nightfall. So what's the problem? Mechusar Tvila. No, because he's still missing Tvila. Okay. Tvul Yom Nami Mechusar Harav Shemesh. The Tvul Yom, I will say, is still what? He's still missing nightfall. In other words, everybody's missing something. That's the whole point over here. So you're gonna say, I can include the Tvul Yom as part of the Chabura, because by nightfall he'll be fine. All he's missing is night. But he's saying, you can't include the Tamei Sheretz, because he's missing Tvila. Or the Tvul Yom is missing Harav Shemesh. So I don't understand, everybody's missing something. So the Gemara says, Harav Shimshon Ameila Arva. The Gemara says, here's the difference. Harav Shemesh, I will say, the Tvul Yom is missing something that will automatically occur on its own. Nightfall will occur on its own. But if the guy who's Tamei Tumas Sheretz is missing Tvila, that Tvila doesn't occur on its own. It requires human dynamic activity. And maybe he won't do it. So the Gemara says, Mechusar Kippurim Nami HaMechusar Kapara. But the guy who's Mechusar Kippurim, he's missing his carbonic offerings. So Rabbi says, if you're going to make a distinction between if you're missing something that's going to occur on its own, we could shecht on your behalf. But if you're missing something that you still have to do, we're afraid you're going to be derelict in your responsibilities to not do it. Well, the Mechusar Kippurim, so you can shecht on behalf of Mechusar Kippurim. Mechusar Kippurim still has to bring karbanos. So why aren't we concerned that maybe he's going to be derelict in his responsibility to bring karbanos? So the Gemara says, Mechusar Kippurim, Nami HaMechusar Kapara, Shekina Biyado. Oh, what's the case? The case is where he has his carbon already set aside. Tamei Sheretz Nami Hare Mikvah Lefanov. Maybe the Tamei Sheretz was, he could set it up as a case where the mikvah, he has a VIP mikvah, private, heated, it's ready for him to go. So why is that? Why would that prevent him from being part of the Chabura? Dilma Pasha, because we're afraid maybe the Tamei Tumah Sheretz is not going to go to the mikvah. He'll be a Posheya. So the Gemara excuse me. The Gemara says, "Ihachi mechuscher purim nami dilma pasha." I don't understand. If you're going to tell me that you're afraid that the person is not going to do what he needs to do, so mechuscher purim also maybe he's not going to offer up his karban. Kegon demasrinhu lebezdin. What's the case? The case is where the individual's mechuscher kapara already gave his karbanos over to the bezdin of kohanim to offer it up on his behalf. The amar chazaka in bezdin shal kohanim omdim misham. That there was a special basin of Kohanim. The individual gave over his karbanos to the basin of Kohanim, and there's a chazaka that the Kohanim do what they're supposed to do. They do not leave. They don't close up shop for the day until they offered up all their karbanos. In the case of Mechusar Kapara, ultimately, again, who could participate in the Chabura, even though he's not fit now, but will become fit later, is a case where he gave over his karbanos to the basin of Kohanim. So therefore, again, it's not in his hands anymore. We're not afraid, even if he quote-unquote forgets, it doesn't matter. He's given over the karbanos to a group of Kohanim. Kohanim's reason him, and therefore it says, if ultimately, again, the karban has been offered. By the case of Tumah Sheretz, apparently we're afraid that halacha l'maisa, he's not going to go to the mikvah. So the Gemara says, "L'Rav midaraisa mechsechazi." But 1 second. According to Rav Abosai, a guy who's Tamei Tumah Sheretz midaraisa actually. The Gemara says, I'm sorry. So we'll say, according to Rav, are we saying over here that midoraisa, ultimately, again, the guy who's Tamei Tumah Sheretz is fit for Karban Pesach, but Rabbanon were gozer? So the Gemara says, if that's the case, Alama Amarav, then why did Rav say, Mitamin Echad Mehen B'Sheretz? So we'll say, listen to this. We'll say, remember going back to this for just a moment? Halacha l'maisa, if you have an exact 50-50 split, Tamei and Tahorin, that's problematic. Remember, one of the approaches was, you make just one more person Tamei. Right? Remember we had this discussion, do you need one person to tilt the scales, two people to tilt the scales? So Rav said, how do you tilt the scales in the form of Tumah? Make one guy Tamei Tumah Sheretz. Then Rabbi said, if one guy Tamei Tumah Sheretz is enough to tilt the scales to make all of Klal Yisrael 51% Tamei and Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor, that means Tumah Sheretz is not the Rabbanon. That means Tumah Sheretz is D'Oraisa. So the Gemara says, El Rav min D'Oraisa nami lo chazi. According to Rav, in reality, someone who's Tamei Tumah Sheretz is really not fit min D'Oraisa. Ish kiye tamei lenefesh. So the Gemara says, what's the case? Milo askinon shechal shvi shelo lios berav Pesach. That classic case of tamei tumas meis, is that not talking about a situation of someone whose seventh day of corpse tuma turned out to be on erev Pesach? Tanu tumas sheretz, which is the equivalent of, this is actually interesting. A guy who's tamei tumas meis on day 7 is effectively the same thing as someone who's tamei tumas sheretz. So it's like, why? Because both of them go to the mikvah on that day and are tahar that night. And ultimately the Torah says in such a situation a person goes to Pesach Sheni. V'chi tema mimai dahachi savla Rabbi Yitzchak the Amar Tamet, so the Amar Tmei Meis Mitzvah Hayu Shechal Shvi Shalios Berav Pesach. So we'll say that ultimately, again, what's the case? It's a case of Tamei Tumas Meis Mitzvah who Shvi'i, their 7th day of purification, turns out to be on Erev Pesach. Shenemar V'lo Yachlu Lasos HaPesach Bayomahu Bayomahu De'inan Yicholin Lasos. Ava lamachar yicholin lasos v'amar Rachmana nidchu. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so you see over here that someone who's Tamei Tumas Meis, whose day number 7 turns out to be on Erev Pesach, you see Abba say that such an individual is set aside to Pesach Sheni. So Abba say, interestingly enough, what the Gemara is suggesting, this is fascinating, is that a guy who's Tamei Tumas Sheretz is the same Tumah as someone who is Tamei Tumas Meis on day number 7. Both of them are effectively the same state. Namely, they both go to the mikveh that day, but ultimately don't really become tar until that night, and yet those individuals are set aside until Pesach Sheni. Therefore, I will say that's why the Gemara said that the person who's Tamei Tumas Sheretz, it doesn't offer up Karban Pesach on Pesach Rishon, but instead is set aside to Pesach Sheni. Good. Tanan, Zav Shirash Dei Re'iyos Shoftan Al B'Shvi'i. So we'll say if a Zav had 2 Re'iyos and his 7th day is Erev Pesach, we shacht on his behalf. My lab delo tavel. is not the case where he didn't go to the mikvah. Ushma mina shoktin v'zarkin al tamei sheretz. And Abba, you would see from here that halacha l'maisa, you still shecht and offer up on behalf of someone who's tamei tumas sheretz. To which the Gemara says, lo, the tavil. All right, well, so we'll have to stop over here. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem with this Tanan of Shabbos. So again, we're still trying to figure out the role or the status, ultimately, again, of Tumas Sheretz in this greater discussion. Emirat Hashem to be continued. Shkach Vosei. What is this? This one. Oh, sorry.